got a couple missing. We better fire away because we've got quite a bit of work to get through this morning. So, good morning, welcome to today's information session, and I'll just read this out again for the benefit of the people who are watching this online, that this workshop is open to the public. It's for staff to provide guidance to elected members, and it's not a forum for debates or decisions, and nor is it a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or to bring other matters to the attention of council. If a member of the public does want to provide input, they can talk to staff and they can help you to have your say. So, we'll fire up into the briefings, and first up we've got the Independent Hearings Panel recommendations on Plan Change 14, Housing and Business Choice. So I'll hand over to Mark. I can Brent to kick us away with your presentation. Welcome. What did I say, Mark? Sorry about that.
Thank you, Chair. We've got quite a lot to get through in this briefing and discussion, so I'll just summarise what it is that we're here to talk about and to try and sort through today. The context is that, as you all know, the Independent Hearings Panel on Plan Change 14 delivered its recommendation report to the Council last Tuesday. The Minister has set a timetable for the Council to make its decisions on those recommendations, and that timetable requires the Council to publicly notify its decision on matters that are within scope of Policy 3 and 4 of the MPS, and I'll come back to that in a moment, by the 12th of September, and must issue its decision and publicly notify its decision on all other matters by December next year. Now, before going too far into this presentation, I'll explain a little bit the way we propose to deal with any questions arising today in relation to the briefing we're doing today and another briefing that is proposed for Tuesday of next week. What we're doing today is talking about the legal context and the process for decision making. That's the first part of today's presentation, and I'll be talking to that. And then we'll have questions on that part of the presentation. Following that, Ike will be talking about and describing the IHP recommendations in summary, and only referring to what those recommendations are. He won't be expressing any opinions on the merits of those decisions, and the reason for that will be apparent to you in a moment. Today then, what we intend to achieve is a full understanding of the legal and planning context within which you're required to make decisions, and collating any questions that you might have of clarification for the IHP. The reason for that is that because of that timetable I mentioned a moment ago, there's not a lot of time for the Council to make fully informed decisions on the IHP recommendations. And if you've got any questions that you want to clarify about the IHP recommendations, now is the time to find out. And so staff need to know from you whether you have any of those questions.
Excuse me, Pauline, it's hard to hear in the gallery. Could the speakers use their microphones more?
Sorry about that, Helen. We do have hearing aids, don't we?
Or perhaps use speakers. There's two microphones here.
Yeah, we do have it. Yeah. We'll see if we can get you some headphones.
Thank you.
Thanks. Carry on.
Now, I mentioned that there's another briefing booked in for Tuesday next week. Now, the purpose of that briefing will be partly to provide considered answers to any questions that you raise today, because it might not be possible or appropriate to answer those questions on the fly today. And second reason is because when you are making your decisions on the 4th of September, to state the obvious, you need to do so in a fully informed way. So if there's any matters on which you seek more detail about the reasons for the IHP recommendations, a role of staff is to collate that information to make it easier for you to find and make bundles of information available to you. So that might be one of the other purposes for the briefing on the 13th of August. That's summarised in a way, some of the key takeaways that we would hope to achieve through the briefing today, that you have a full understanding of the decision-making process, the timing requirements for the decision, what you do, what you are required to decide on by law on the 4th of September, and what you can delay if you choose to. Some discussion about judicial review risk and how you avoid it in the way that you make your decisions and the way you interact with communities between now and the time you make your decisions. Full understanding of the options available to you when you are making decisions on the 4th of September, and an understanding of the next steps in the process. That's the legal bit, and then we'll turn to Ike's planning summary of what exactly the IHP are recommending. The purpose of this slide is to highlight where we are in the statutory decision-making process. We have up here a timeline starting in the top left and ending in the bottom right. The stage we're currently at is that the IHP has made its recommendations. That's the red box top right. Getting to that position has been a process that has involved extensive public engagement. The first step was that the RMA was changed to require councils to do an intensification planning instrument, an IPI. The council then drafted a plan change, and there was extensive community engagement in that process. Council appointed an IHP, and then there was again extensive community engagement in the process leading up to the notification of the plan change. There was then a statutory process of submissions, evidence and hearings in which anyone could and did take part. And then we've got the IHP recommendations. So that was the period of community engagement. The statute doesn't provide for any community engagement in the decision-making process past that hearings point. And that's important for the way the council is required by law to approach its decision-making. As I said before, I'll answer any questions about the legal and process part at the end of the legal section. Now, the statute provides for clarifications for the council to be able to ask the IHP for clarifications of anything in the IHP recommendation report. And that's something that I mentioned a moment ago as an important step, and now's the time for doing that. After getting those clarifications, the statute says the council has to make its decision on the IHP recommendations. Now, that decision is to either accept or reject the recommendations. And if the council rejects an IHP recommendation, the minister is then the decision maker on that recommendation. The council has the option, when it rejects an IHP recommendation, or if it rejects an IHP recommendation, of making its own recommendation to the minister, so proposing an alternative to what the IHP was recommending. And then the minister will decide on whether to favour the IHP recommendation or the council recommendation. Now, I mentioned earlier on that there's two deadlines for the council to make its decision on Plan Change 14, set by the minister in the Gazette notice. The first one is that the council's required to make its decision on those areas that are subject to policies 3 and 4 of the National Policy Statement. Notify those decisions by the 12th of September. We've got a slide a little bit further on that just gives you a reminder of what I mean by the policy 3 and 4 areas. That's referring to intensification in the central city and intensification around the central city and commercial areas. That's what I mean by making a decision on the policy 3 and 4 matters. So there's a decision that the council will be making under the Local Government Act rather than the RMA on the 4th of September, and that is whether to make a decision on the parts of the IHP recommendations that it isn't required to make a decision on by the 12th of September. So they're the matters outside of policy 3 and 4 areas. If the council decides that it doesn't want to make a decision on those matters yet, then it's subject to the Minister's current deadline of making a decision on those by December of next year. And what we've flagged in this timeline up here is that central government, second to last box in the bottom row on the right, central government, as you all know, has indicated that it intends to make some changes to the RMA by about the middle of next year, or propose changes to the RMA by about the middle of next year. And it's indicated that it intends that those changes will make the MDRS optional, subject to conditions. And we don't know until we see the legislation what those conditions might be. So the prospect of that happening is something that you might want to take into account when you're making your decision under the Local Government Act on the 4th of September about whether to delay decision making on the aspects of PC14 that you aren't required to decide on. The purpose of this slide is to highlight some of the uncertainties that I described a moment ago that we've got inherent in the process. There's nothing particularly unusual about having uncertainties over outcomes and what central government might do or might not do, but it's useful to highlight what some of those uncertainties might be here. The first one in the top left is one that arises from the detail of the IHP recommendations in relation to the residential chapter. Now, this came to light as we were going through those recommendations last week, and staff filed a memorandum late last week seeking clarification from the IHP in relation to this issue. And the IHP provided that clarification in a minute that they issued, I think it was this morning. The IHP requires redrafting of the residential chapter in the plan, and that redrafting is going to take a bit of time. It creates some significant uncertainty about whether the council is going to be able to do that in time for the members to make a decision on the IHP recommendations on the residential chapter by the 12th of September. The council might simply be unable to meet that deadline for the residential chapter. We'll give you some more information about that. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to do it today, but possibly within the next day or two. Now, if more time is needed to do that work for the residential chapter, as I said before, the Minister had issued a Gazette notice that requires the council to issue all its decisions by the 12th of September on policy 3 and 4 areas. It's not clear whether the Minister will extend that timeline insofar as that's relevant to the residential chapter before the 12th of September. We're also not certain when central government will make changes to or introduce a bill to make changes to the RMA. They're predicting that it be by, I think, the middle of next year, but has been known for central governments to not stick to their deadlines. We also aren't totally sure what the changes to the RMA are going to be. We've seen the indications from the current government, but we won't know for sure until there's been some more work put in at central government level into that. We also don't know whether, when that legislation is changed, whether that will leave enough time for the council to engage with the result of that in the context of Plan Change 14 before the date of the Gazette notice direction that the council will issue its decision on the non-policy 3 and 4 areas. That's December next year. We don't know whether central government will extend that deadline, and we don't know whether central government will enable the council to simply discontinue the parts of Plan Change 14 if council decides to put parts of Plan Change 14 on hold, waiting to see what those changes are. This is a reference slide for your information. I won't talk to this. It's simply reinforcing what I mean when I talk about making a decision on policy 3 and 4 areas. Policy 3 and 4 of the MPS require maximised intensification within the central city and at least 6 stories high within a walkable catchment from the central city, and a commensurate scale of intensification around other commercial centres. That was policy 3. Policy 4 is the one that says councils can introduce things called qualifying matters that limit the amount of intensification that's enabled by the medium density residential standards. Turning to the principles that apply to all decision making by councils, and apply, to state the obvious here as well. Usual rules that you bring to all your decision making apply here. Keep an open mind until the council meeting. Don't predetermine anything, and don't say anything that could be taken as implying that you have predetermined anything. When you do make your decision, you're required to have regard to all relevant information and disregard all irrelevant information. You're also required to ensure that you're fully informed for the purpose of making your decision. Now, sometimes, or in standard council processes, it's the job of staff to help you be fully informed by expressing opinions, telling you what they think about the topics that you're addressing. Staff aren't able to do that here. And I'll take you to the legislation in a moment that says that staff aren't able to do that. So in order for you to be fully informed for the purpose of making your decision, it's the role of staff to gather the information and help you find it. Avoid, if you can, being drawn into discussions where you're being asked to comment on the IHP recommendations, at risk of suggesting that you've predetermined anything, or at risk of expressing opinions before you are fully informed. Again, these are just standard good decision-making sort of guidance. Now, there is something a little bit specific about decision-making on Plan Change 14 that we're highlighting in this slide. The legislation itself says what you need to take into account when you're making your decision. And the legislation says that, number 3 up here, you can't consider anything that wasn't before the IHP. So your decision making is confined to the IHP materials. So that's the plan change that the council notified, any reports on that plan change, the IHP report itself, any submissions that were lodged with the IHP, all reports that were delivered to the IHP, all evidence, all legal submissions, all memos, all minutes, and the IHP recording, its transcript. So that's the relevant information. Good guidance for decision making. Make sure that you consider all relevant IHP materials on a topic, not selective reading of it. So don't confine your reading to, for example, what any one submitter said or just what the council's expert said, because that would not be fully informing yourself of the issues. As I said, you can't consider anything that wasn't before the IHP. That's what the legislation says. So stuff that wasn't before the IHP is communications that you get from anyone, newspaper articles, letters to the editor, social media, or signs. Now, because of those constraints that are described, staff are not able to express opinions to you on the IHP recommendations, because if they did, you would then be receiving and potentially taking into account information that wasn't before the IHP. So it's a peculiar aspect of this decision making, but there is that constraint on the assistance that staff are able to give you. The reason we're saying all this is because it's good decision making, it's what you're required to do by law, and if you don't do it, there's a judicial review risk. People can ask the High Court to set your decision making aside. On top of that, civil claims for damages if people suffer damage as a result. Now, I've already touched on what we're summarising again in this slide a little bit, but it's highlighting what your decision is going to be about on the 4th of September. First, the decision that is a result of the two dates in the Gazette notice, the 12th of September date for making a decision on the IHP recommendations that are subject to policies 3 and 4, and the December 2025 date being a deadline for making and issuing public notices on decisions on all other aspects of PC 14. So because of those two dates in the Gazette notice, your first decision on the 4th of September is what do you want to decide on in the area in which that you have that discretion to delay decision making. Do you want to decide on anything outside of policy 3 and 4 areas? Or do you want to decide on everything outside of 3 and 4 areas? After having made that decision, you are then making your accept, reject, or alternative recommendation decision on the IHP recommendations that you have decided to decide on and that you are required to decide on. So your options are: you accept the IHP recommendation. The RMA says that if you accept the IHP recommendation, it becomes part of the operative plan immediately. So the plan is pretty much changed from that date, or at least as soon as you've publicly notified that decision, which is going to be by the 12th of September. So that's the process complete. There's no rights of appeal. If you reject an IHP recommendation, you've got two options. One is just reject, and then the minister will decide whether the minister accepts that IHP recommendation. The other option is reject it and make an alternative recommendation to the minister. If you reject and make an alternative recommendation to the minister then decides between those two options, either the IHP recommendation or your recommendation. There's no timeline for the minister to make that decision. once the Minister does make a decision on any of the IHP recommendations that you've that you've rejected, on whether to favour an IHP recommendation or your recommendation, once the Minister does that, the process is complete. There's no appeal rights. The Minister's decision goes straight into the operative plan. One of the reasons why I was highlighting before the role of council staff to help collate information relevant to making your decisions is that if you give staff early enough indication of matters in which you would like to investigate the possibility of making an alternative recommendation, then the role of staff is to help you be fully informed, help all members be fully informed in order to assess the IHP recommendation and what the alternative recommendation might be. So the sooner you can tell us that, the sooner staff can put the work into collating that information, to getting it to you, so you can do all that reading in advance of the council meeting on the 4th of September. This is a really wordy slide, so before going through all that, let me just show you this. The IHP recommendations have recommended rejecting a number of the provisions that the council proposed, because the IHP says that a High Court decision says that the council's approach was incorrect. And the purpose of this slide is to just explain what's going on there in the IHP recommendation and in the High Court decision that they're referring to. When the council notified its plan change, it notified a number of provisions which not only restricted EMDRS, so they were qualifying matters, for example, that restricted EMDRS, but also provisions that restricted development that was already enabled by the operative district plan. The question that the High Court answered was whether a council notified plan change, intensification planning instrument, plan change to give effect to the MDRS, whether it's able at law to constrain development that was already enabled by the operative plan, or whether all it could do was constrain the MDRS and the intensification itself. And this wee graph is a nice tidy way of just showing that question. So what the council did was notify provisions that not only constrained development that was enabled by the MDRS, the yellow part there, but also constrained existing development rights. The High Court decided earlier in the year that that's not a correct application of, the High Court decided this for a plan change in the North Island, not in relation to Christchurch, but the principle applies here. The High Court decided that that's not a correct application of the Act, that these plan changes to provide for the intensification can't constrain what's already enabled by the operative plan. The IHP recommendations have applied that decision, have quite properly applied that decision. This council must also apply the High Court decision. If it doesn't do so, again, judicial review risk. And this slide is simply another way of explaining that. Examples of provisions in the first bullet point, examples of notified provisions that constrained development more than the operative plan. There were heritage provisions, that weren't in the operative plan. There were new and extended character areas. There was a change from industrial to mixed-use rezoning. Provisions in relation to significant trees and tree protection radius. There was a radio communication pathway from the emergency centre to the hills that constrained development more than the status quo, and various other matters. So the High Court said that we can't do that. The IHP recommendations have rejected some of the council provisions because of that. And my legal advice to you is that you, just as does the IHP, need to apply the High Court decision. Earlier on, I was describing the process that's set up in the RMA for the intensification planning instruments. And that process, as I described, was one where your option is constrained to accepting an IHP recommendation or rejecting it, or delaying it until you need to make it, which is currently by December of next year. There is another option, because what I was describing was what the statute provides for just that planning instrument. That hasn't changed. The fact that councils are entitled to change their plans through standard RMA process. So that ability remains. So, for example, the matters that IHP has recommended rejecting because it's applying the High Court decision, legal advice to you, as I say, is that you're bound to the High Court decision. It would be not appropriate for you to recommend anything different to the Minister, which goes counter to that decision. But that doesn't stop you from, after having made your decision on Plan Change 14, starting your own plan change process. The council can start a plan change process through standard process. So that could be, again, for character areas, for example, or the heritage matters that couldn't be included in the intensification planning instruments. We have another note on this slide highlighting that, as I was mentioning before, the government's going for housing growth policy. Announcements suggest that it is going to be changing the law next year. And when it does so, there might be new standard plan change requirements. We don't know what they are yet. We're getting close to the end of the legal and process slides. Thanks for your patience in letting me run through these. Staff role and your actions in relation to process between now and the 4th of September. That's the purpose of this slide. So first of all, helping you be fully informed for the purpose of you making your decisions. Staff have already started collating and have finished collating some of these bundles that I was describing before. Ike will be able to describe what has been done already. If you tell us what topics you're particularly interested in, we'll do that work in gathering those further bundles for you. Secondly, seeking clarification from IHP. Now is the time for asking for that clarification. Ike will be shortly running through and summarising for you the key recommendations from the IHP. If you've got any questions about the IHP recommendations that require us to ask questions of clarification of the IHP, now's the time to tell us, so we can get onto that. Again, simply making sure you're going to be fully informed when you make your decisions. Third point up there, might be too early today for getting into this discussion. Well, I think it will be too early today to get into this discussion. But if you are considering making an alternative recommendation to the IHP recommendations, tell staff as soon as possible what sort of area that might be in. And again, it's the job of staff to help you be fully informed when you are proposing, help everyone be fully informed when you're proposing those alternative recommendations. So it's making a bundle of information available from the IHP process on those topics that you've raised. Staff are also able to, if you are, and this might be starting after the next briefing or getting closer to the council meeting, but if you are considering making an alternative recommendation or proposing that council make an alternative recommendation, staff can help in that to a limited extent. They're not going to be able to give you any advice on making a recommendation. They're not going to be able to comment on the merits of making an alternative recommendation, but they can provide a drafting service. I mean, me and the planners can help word things in a way that that ensures that it's clear, that helps you make sure you've covered what you intend to cover in those recommendations. Last note up there is just for your information. Staff are looking at setting up a public webinar to explain what's in the IHP recommendations. That won't be a debate with people about the content of those recommendations, but it will be helping to explain what they are. Okay.
Thanks, Brent. Look, thank you for going through that so slowly and clearly and calmly, because it's quite a lot to take in.
Yeah.
Just with your request for, should there be any alternative ideas or proposals that you want to hear about as soon as possible, obviously, to assist with advice, could we suggest that people put those through the Office of the Chief Executive?
Yes.
And then they'll be compiled with any staff advice and then shared with all of us. Is that the best way for you to handle that?
Yes.
So are you expecting to hear things today, or would you just rather use that process?
Well, we're happy to take notes of them today. If there's any questions about the legal process that I've just described, or the decision-making process, we're happy to take those now.
Yep, we've got a few questions.
When Ike gets into talking about the IHP recommendations, we might be less able to address those on the fly today.
Great. So we've got Mark, Tyler, Yanni and Tim and Sarah.
Yeah, I guess asking a fairly obvious one here, which might be a pretty simple answer from you. Has there been, or is there any ability to request of the Minister extension of that September 12th deadline?
There's nothing stopping the council asking anything of ministers, and if the advice from Ike and Mark and their team is that it is going to take the council longer than the 12th of September to do what the IHP has required the council to do in relation to the residential chapter, then it would be very wise for the council to ask the minister to extend that deadline. Yep. But it's only necessary to do that in relation to the residential chapter. There's, I think I will reinforce this, there's no significant overlap between the residential chapter and the other things that the council can and is required to decide on by the 12th of September.
Yeah, it certainly would be wise, I would see, to get as full a set of information as we can before we make a final decision, surely.
So Tyler?
If it's all right, Pauline, I've got a couple of, that's cool. The first one, kia ora guys, this is all about the legal and process stuff. The first one is just for public knowledge, could we get some clarity on the RMA commissioners or the independent hearing commissioners around their role and their mandate under the RMA about the restrictions that they may have in terms of the way that they vote? I think there's not very much clarity from the public, particularly a lot of submitters, around what the independent commission is there for and how they make those decisions. Would you be able to provide some clarity based on that?
The legislation required the council to appoint a independent hearings panel, and the key word is independent. Independent hearings panels are appointed by the council in standard process quite often. You might remember there have been in your time independent hearings panels on plan changes, for example, that have been promoted by the council. The council appoints suitably qualified experts to make decisions or make recommendations to the council. And here, the legislation required the council to do that for this plan change. Suitably qualified and experienced professionals who are independent of the council. When the independent hearings panel is hearing submissions and evidence and making decisions on the notified provisions, the independent hearings panel is required by law to give no more weight to the council position than to that of any submitter in the process. So council recommendation reports are considered by the independent hearings panel alongside all submissions and all evidence from other people. These independent experts, suitably qualified, very experienced independent experts, exercise independent judgment. And it's wholly appropriate that they do that.
Sure. And the next question leading on to that is around the strength of submitters. For example, a lay submitter in comparison to an expert witness. Do the commissioners themselves treat each submitter equally in terms of the submissions they give?
Yes.
They're
Great.
obliged to. Thanks.
And the last one is around recommending or rejecting and recommending alternative options. Do we recommend alternative options based upon what we see in the IHP report, or could we use alternative means from outside, for example, policies that council have that are currently standing in terms of status quo, etc.?
Your decision making is constrained to, let me look for the exact words.
Anything that's been in front of the IHP.
When making a decision on the IHP recommendations, the council must not consider any submission or other evidence unless it was made available to the independent hearings panel before the panel made the recommendation that's the subject of your decision.
That's great to know. And to avoid predetermination, is there a way that we should be wording these recommendations and options?
At this early stage in the process, you won't have, well, I'm making an assumption here, at this very early stage in the process, you may not have read all relevant information. So the way to word it at this early stage in the process is simply what it is. You're having some initial thoughts, and you'd like us to gather information for you on a particular topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yanni? Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a couple of questions around the legal and the process. One is there hard copies of this upstairs and also at our libraries for people to read?
Of the PowerPoint?
Of the actual IHP. Like, is there one place where we can go if we want to just read all the information that exists, so that we don't have to go on a tiny screen and try and read stuff, which is really
I don't know.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But I think that might be quite helpful. Maybe if we just get maybe two or something, or just a chance.
Is it possible?
Yeah.
Thanks, Yanni.
And I just was kind of interested. And it's a shame the mayor's not here, but the conversations with central government about city deals and about the bigger picture. Is anyone kind of aware of what they are? Because I'm quite confused with the letters going back and forth.
No, not yet. No, there's
But I
just
know that
ideas floating
there's been
around.
some meetings with some ministers by some elected members. But do we have any sense
No, not at the moment.
around that?
Fair
Can
to
we
say, no.
get some sense?
Through you, Chair, that's irrelevant for your decision making on the IHP recommendations. The only things you are entitled to think about in making your decision on the IHP recommendations are the submissions and evidence in front of the
I
IHP.
understand that, but in things like timing, things like potential new changes, the stuff that you've referred to, I would have
Yes.
thought that's very relevant.
A lot of unknowns, Yanni, we
to get
know
a
that,
sense.
but it is what it is.
Yeah, and then can I just check if we just rejected it, or just so referring it straight to the minister for a decision,
Yes.
we have to approve or reject it. We can't just not make a decision. We have to make a decision one way or another.
Yeah, so on the matters that are subject to policy 3 and 4, where the council has to notify its decision by the 12th of September, you don't have the option of doing nothing. So
that's your answer.
You have to make a decision to either accept
No
or
option to
reject.
do nothing.
So, but in terms of, there's no ability to direct refer it to the minister.
Well, by rejecting, you are referring it to the minister.
Okay, and just the final question from me is, between now and whenever the process concludes, is the decision kind of operative in terms of, like, if people are doing developments now, how are they assessed against what this notified plan is?
Yeah, we've been working through that a little bit with the resource consent team. The rules in Plan Change 14 are a relevant matter when someone's processing a resource consent application. The operative plan remains the operative plan, but the new plan is also relevant. When the council makes its decision on the 4th of September, if the council there accepts an IHP recommendation, then that's pretty much changed the plan from that date. If the council decision is to reject an IHP recommendation, then the notified plan change is still relevant when processing resource consent applications, and it's weighed up appropriately by the resource consent planners. Not sure whether that's fully answered your question.
Also, if you get an application for a high building in Linwood, higher than the current operative plan, nothing in accordance with the notified plan. How does staff assess, or how does the decision makers assess which one gets preference?
Well, under Section 104 of the RMA, it says that whenever anyone's processing a resource consent application, they have to take into account adverse effects on the environment, the operative plan, the proposed plan, the regional policy statement, and any other relevant matter. And so we can't talk about that in the abstract.
Okay.
We'd need to talk about specific applications. Maybe if we take that discussion offline and deal with it separately.
I guess I'd be interested if we have any sense of how many consents have we issued above our operative plan.
No, I've got no idea for the purpose of this discussion, but we can find out.
Thanks.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, at times people kind of talk about judicial review and threaten council with judicial review. I think with regards to the public webinar that the staff are putting through, it'd be really good to give some information on what basis judicial reviews are undertaken, because I do not think that some people that look at it as an out, if you like, understand the process and the basis of judicial reviews.
Yeah, sure. We'll have a think about it, including a short summary of that in a webinar.
It's not helpful for staff and themselves and the people if it's baseless, if it's not understood.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah.
Thank
Good
you.
point. Sarah? And then we'll move on to the
Kia ora,
next
thanks
bit.
for that. I'll stack of questions. I'll just make sure that it's the process ones first. While we can't be predetermined, that doesn't in any way constrain our ability to talk about amendments and things we'd like to change in it, because once we get the information, we may or not decide to do them or change them. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, just checking. And when it comes to potential alternatives that we might propose, we will be bound by the evidence that's there. We will need to put together evidence or get help from staff to put together the evidence for that change that then goes to the minister and the advisors. Are we allowed to choose something that wasn't just the original notified plan as our
Yes.
alternative? So, but does it have to be something that someone else proposed? Or does there just have to be reasonable evidence within the documents for it?
Yeah, good question. So if if the council rejects an IHP recommendation and makes an alternative recommendation to the minister, the council's got the option, and it would be a little bit silly if the council didn't take up this option, of giving reasons why it's rejecting a recommendation and it's proposing something different. What the council would be trying to do in giving those reasons is explain to the minister why the council's recommendation is preferable over the IHP's recommendation.
Yeah.
So in order to do that, presumably what you'd want to do is point to submissions and evidence that supported that
Yeah.
in the IHP process.
That's cool. With our local government decision in September, as opposed to the RMA decisions, are we able to get advice and recommendations from staff on that, since it's a local government decision rather than an RMA one?
Yes, but this is where it gets a little bit curly, doesn't it? Because
It relates to an RMA decision.
Because you'll be entitled to, you'll be able to take that into account for the purpose of the LTA decision, but not for the RMA decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So will we be getting advice on, even without a recommendation, the pros and cons within a report, the pros and cons of splitting the decision making to the policy 3-4 matters and others, or both together?
Yes, to the extent that staff are comfortable doing that without it cross-contaminating the RMA decision making.
That would be useful, just having some sort of table or whatever that outlines pros and cons of both, even with no recommendation. It's just
Yes.
weighing up. These are the things you should be weighing up, kind of thing, when you make this decision.
Yeah.
That would be good. That one's done. When it comes to clarifications, do we ask those today? I mean, it's hard to ask for clarification still, because we've got 549 pages of recommendations still. Like, I've got a couple, including maps, and I've just had a response on that, but that's part of the clarifications. So as a council, elected council, do we ask for those, or do you ask for those? If you're not sure.
If any member wants to raise any of them either today, we'll simply make a note of it and make a list.
Yeah.
And we'll distribute that list to all members before filing another memo with the IHP.
Okay. Yeah. So I've sent through an email already asking for the maps based on those and the numbers that have been enabled by their decision, as opposed to the numbers that were notified, that kind of thing.
Sure.
The other one would be on the walkable section, the walkable catchment for the central city. So I note that in part 3 of the recommendations, it talks about the walkable catchment for the central city. It notes that the policy 3-4 is directive as to there must be a walkable catchment, an appropriate walkable catchment used. But then it says we decided not to do one because of real world conditions and the fact that you couldn't walk to a supermarket from the north of the CBD. Can we get some clarification as to whether they considered the local amenities available within the walkable catchment proposed, as opposed to just the amenities that are available within the central city zone? So, for example, I note that the lack of a supermarket on the north of the city was one thing that was submitted on by one submitter and is in the decision, the recommendation report. But actually, if you extended the walkable catchment, you wouldn't necessarily be going to a supermarket within the central city. So within the proposed walkable catchment, there are supermarkets, if you like. You wouldn't need to go. Does that make sense? Can we get that clarified on that real world grounding stuff?
The question makes sense. We'll record the question. We'll put it in a list of anything else that members are proposing that we seek clarification, and we'll paraphrase it back to you before we send that memo off to the IHP.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, we'll get on with our second part. Please.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. What I thought I'd do in terms of an overview of the key recommendations is firstly just begin with the high level in terms of fundamentally what we're talking about, focusing just on the policies 3 and 4 elements. And then I'll show some imagery from a spatial point of view, what the recommendations recommend in terms of those catchments, and go into some detail of provisions that have been recommended within those areas. So first and foremost, Central City, as has been discussed, the recommendation has been to focus intensification more or less within the 4 avenues. I've listed there all of the different chapters and sub-chapters that relates to. It's not to intimidate, but more to highlight what will be coming when the decision is made, or the report is coming for the September decision making as well. Relevant to all of that are the following qualifying matters as well. So when you're making a policy 3-4 decision based on the Central City, then the following qualifying matters that are listed there are also relevant. In terms of the other local centres that have been recommended, town, local and neighbourhood centres, the relevant chapters are listed there, and also the relevant qualifying matters. It's probably easier to say that almost all qualifying matters in terms of just a policy 3 catchment are relevant. There's only one qualifying matter, I believe it is flood ponding area, that falls outside of that, so effectively there'll be a decision that is relevant to all of those qualifying matters there. In terms of the third one, this is where it gets a little bit of a hybrid in a way. There are a number of chapters that cover both solely MDRS matters and policy 3 matters. And what we will need to do for those subchapters is effectively annotate where a part of the subchapter is only relevant to MDRS on the basis that council intends to make only a policy 3-4 decision. Then those parts of the subchapters wouldn't be decided upon. And I listed some of them there. There are also a bunch of other chapters there as well that are all relevant to those qualifying matters as well. If you don't mind, the questions at the end would be good. Yeah.
Yep.
Great, thank you. In terms of a visual, what this image is trying to demonstrate is that the darker red areas are the areas where effectively high density has been recommended to be constrained to from the IHP. Everything that you can see in that orange colour that goes beyond that is what we had notified for high density around the Central City, being a minimum of a 1.2 walking catchment, and so again largely constraining around the 4 AVs. What you may also be able to see beneath that overlay around the Central City is a blue outline there. That was denoting a specific precinct which was for a higher building height of 32 metres that we had notified, or 10 stories at that point. And it also just highlighting that the point there with Carlton Milne would be excluded because of how the IHP have limited the walking catchment response around that area as well. Moving on to some of the larger town centres, which is Papanui, Hornby and Riccarton as well. What we've tried to demonstrate there is the walking catchment that is being described, which they describe as generally being 800 metres, and then the IHP recommendation further goes into specifically detailing in reality what that should be. And so the point there being that under policy 3D there is no requirement to have a walking catchment. Walking catchment are simply used as a vehicle to deliver the commensurate response. And so within the recommendation, the IHP denotes what they recommend should be the limitations of high density around all of those larger town centres. And just, I guess, broadly on the mapping, under minute 46, the IHP outlines a process for effectively validating the mapping exercise. So that's a process that we are currently going through. So all of these illustrations reflecting the narrative which is outlined in the recommendations, we'll be going back to the IHP on to seek confirmation on as well. Oh, one back, please. Just in terms of Riccarton and Church Corner, again, the larger red catchments, red areas showing what the IHP had recommended in terms of detailing the limits of high density extent. You can see there the areas that aren't covered in the orange would be kept simply as medium density rather than high density. This is showing what we had notified as part of the plan change. And then you can see, I guess, where they have applied their discretion beyond the 800 metre, recognising again that it's just an input into policy 3D response. In terms of the other town centres, Shirley, Linwood and North Horswell. For Shirley and Linwood, they have recommended the retention of the latest extent that we had for high density, which is based on a 600 metre walking catchment. I've included for Shirley the qualifying matter that's quite relevant, being the wastewater constraints qualifying matter, vacuum sewers, which they have sought to recommend to accept. That obviously is quite relevant in the context of Shirley, because effectively what the qualifying matter would do is say that there isn't any further households beyond the operative what's there. So while the zoning, what I'm trying to highlight is while the zoning is high density, in reality it would take a considerable amount of work to actually achieve that because of that qualifying matter. So that colours the overall implementation of that for Shirley. For North Horswell, the recommendation has been to not extend or not progress with what had been recommended for the high density around the North Horswell catchment, and instead to retain that as medium density. They haven't specified a catchment, and that is a point that we'll be seeking clarification on. But regardless, it would be seen to be aligning with the rest of medium density in the surrounds beyond that as well. For the other larger local centres, which are Merivale, Sydenham and Church Corner, which you previously had as well, they have also specified again specific catchments and specific areas where high density should be limited to. So for Merivale there you can see the high density in orange that would be changed to being medium density, and only in the red shaded area would high density be retained. Just to note with the Merivale extent, obviously that is influenced by what council had notified for the walking catchment from the central city, so there is an overlap there in catchment. So that does, I guess, amplify how much high density would have otherwise been there had the recommendation been to accept the notified proposal. For Sydenham, like Brent mentioned earlier, the IHP has rejected the mixed-use proposal for industrial zoning further to the north there, but they have accepted the high density that we had further to the south of Brougham Street there. There is a small section further to the west, which would just be turned back into medium density effectively. For other local centres and neighbourhood centres, council had notified a local centre intensification precinct, which was to exist really on top of medium density zoned areas for specific centres. I'll touch on it in a moment. And that was really enabling 4-storey development and perimeter block developments as well. That has been recommended to be removed, and instead the recommendation is that all local centres, not just ones of larger significance, should have a 200 metre catchment of medium density rather than just a precinct of 4 stories. So just medium density at 200 metres around all local centres. And then the position that council had put forward for neighbourhood centres, being the smallest of centres, so think about your local dairies and things like that. Council would recommended to simply have medium density in the surrounds of that, which the IHP have recommended to be accepted. However, they haven't denoted a catchment for that, and again, that is a point we're seeking clarity on. In terms of the local neighbourhood centres, I've listed all of the local centres there. So again, all of these centres would have a 200 metre walking catchment applied around that, and that would be a medium density. And so that's to keep in mind in terms of the policy 3.4 decision that may be on the cards for September. All of those centres would have medium density applied at 200 metres following that decision as well. So in terms of height controls for those respective zones, again within the 4 avenues is largely the focus of intensification. The zoning extents for commercial has largely been, almost I think has entirely been accepted as in no rezoning to high density or alike as well. The names have simply been updated from what is in the operative plan to reflect national planning standards. Building height control has been rejected in terms of what council had notified. Council had notified effectively a 90 metre height limit, and what has been recommended by the hearings panel is to set effectively no control, and by I mean no control for a discretionary activity. So planning in a nutshell, there are different activity statuses throughout the spectrum of consenting applications. Effectively, the higher you go, the more evidence that's required. Discretionary is towards the top. Restricted discretionary effectively means that an application can be made and the plan must specify against what specific discretion council is applying, and any conditions must align with those specific considerations as well. What the IHP have recommended is that framework should apply from 45 metres. So in principle, in terms of that full discretionary activity status under the Act, that has recommended to be rejected, and simply a lower tier being restricted discretionary activity would apply from 45 metres. So if you compare that to the operative controls that we have in the district plan, which is generally about 28 metres, that is a fair step change that's there. There are a number of qualifying matters that have been accepted or rejected by the IHP within that area as well, which I've listed there as well. Effectively what it means is that the operative controls that we had for heritage for New Regent Street and also the arts centres have been proposed to be retained, again applying the High Court lens over that in terms of operative controls. We had proposed a further height restriction around those operative heritage overlays, effectively a transition to those what could be much higher levels of intensification around that, and those have been rejected or recommended to be rejected by the IHP. Similarly, we also had a lesser height for Victoria Street and for sites around Cathedral Square, limiting to 45 metres, and those have also been rejected and recommended to be rejected. And like Brent said, the radio communication pathways from the Justice Precinct has also been recommended to be rejected on the basis of the High Court precedent. For high density surrounding that, again limited to only the 4 avenues has been recommended, and so the larger 1.2 to a maximum of 1.9 walking catchment has been recommended to be rejected that council had notified. There is a 22 metre permitted height limit for all high density, really as a minimum, for high density residential zoning, that is, within the 4 avenues. That's the only area where there is 22 metres is the entry point for height, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Again, within that specific precinct, the Central City Residential Precinct, there's a much higher height limit that's set at 39 metres that has been recommended, or about 12 stories as well. So for the larger 3 town centres, the commercial height within the centre has been recommended at 32 metres or about 10 stories, and we had notified 22 metres. An 800 metre walking catchment, like we've shown earlier, has been the input to their considerations. We had notified a 600 metre walking catchment for those three centres. The walking catchment approach has been recommended to be changed. We had effectively drawn a walking catchment that was somewhat near the edge of the centre where there were buildings rather than the centre of the centre. The IHP have recommended to take the latter approach, being that the walking catchment is taken from the centre of the centre. Long story short, what that effectively means is that the full extent of the catchment is reduced because it's not taking in effectively the depth of the centre itself. And so you can see that in some of those images if you turn back to those. Keep that in mind. For high density residential zones surrounding those centres, a permitted height limit of 14 metres is recommended, and then a restricted discretionary consent thereafter. There is no higher limit or higher threshold for activity status beyond that. It is simply a restricted discretionary consent, and that aligns with the requirements of the NPSUD as well in terms of that ceiling, if you will. The requests from some submitters for other centre for classifications, including the likes of metropolitan centres for those three centres, has been recommended to be rejected by the IHP. And then there's also been recommended to be rejected a specific qualified matter relevant to only the Riccarton catchment for the Riccarton Bush interface area has been recommended to be rejected. However, staff are intending to seek clarification on this matter for various reasons as well. For the other town centres, Shirley and Linwood, the commercial centre itself recommended at 22 metres or 6 stories, which is what we had notified, and then a 600 metre walking catchment as the input from that. Again, the high density extent that we have most recently in terms of the council right of reply has been recommended to be the high density extent. We had notified 400 metres. Same approach in terms of the permitted height limit for high density, 14 metres recommended, restricted discretionary thereafter. Like I said earlier, for North Hawesville, medium density has been recommended to be only applied adjacent to the commercial zoning, whilst the commercial zoning has been recommended at a height of 22 metres, which is what we had notified. Again, we are intending to seek clarification on the extent of the medium density. For Merivale, Church, Corin and Sydenham, these are the larger local centres in the surrounds, similar to the other town centres really. 22 metres has been recommended, or 6 stories for the commercial height, which is what we'd recommended. There's a 400 metre walking catchment. Again, they've sought to recommend a alternative approach to the walking catchment, being the centre of the centre approach. But the 400 metres is really what we had notified as well. Same approach in terms of permitted height at 14 as well. And the IHP have recommended against the mixed use zoning for industrial zoning for Sydenham and the surrounds as well. For what we called medium local centres, we had again proposed a local centre intensification precinct, like I said earlier, being the 4 stories. And that was at various catchments for various centres. So for Bishopdale, Barrington, we had 400 metres and then 200 metres around Preston's. IHP again have recommended to reject this proposal. Instead, there's a generic 200 metres catchment for all local centres, but only at medium density rather than the further enabled precinct approach that council had notified. For the commercial elements of local and neighbourhood centres, the IHP have recommended that a 14 metre commercial height within the centre is applied. We had notified 12 metres, and again, only in the surrounds, only medium density in the surrounds, and we're again seeking clarifications in terms of the extent of that, as it's not specified. There are some other zoning recommendations that are worthwhile to note. However, what I'd highlight is these are largely outside of the policy 3-4 areas, but worthwhile to mention nonetheless. Council had proposed to introduce a future urban zoning which adopts National Planning Standards Framework, and that would effectively be applied around what is known on the operative plan as residential new neighbourhood areas. They are really greenfield areas where there are outlined development plans, and we've notified that so that there's better oversight in terms of being able to apply those outlined development plans. That was proposed for areas that had yet to be consented or developed. The IHP have recommended to reject that approach, instead applying medium density for all of those future urban areas as well. In some cases, there are some new commercial centres as well. I can think of one, and there is potential for some high density as well as a result of catchments near, or centres near future urban zones and their respective catchments. For the Port Hills residential areas, the IHP have recommended that the operative overlays that contained within the residential hill zone and any development plan areas, the zoning within those areas and their respective overlays development plans should remain as they are. The IHP have considered that they are not in a whole irrelevant residential zones, and they lie outside of the scope of Plan Change 14. So they've recommended no change there from the operative. However, in any area that is residentially hill zoned and there are no existing operative overlays as such, the recommendation is for medium density to apply across those areas. Staff are also intending to seek clarification on what we had proposed as being the residential hills precinct. The precinct was intended to ensure that the vacant allotment size for development on the hills that we had under the operative at 650 square metres would hold, and there was also a tie to operative controls for roof reflectivity as well, considering the prominence of the hills and the effect on flatter areas as well. Again, seeking clarification on whether or not that has been carried over, as it seems unclear at this stage. So in terms of qualifying matters and financial contributions, this is the list of those that the hearings panel have recommended to be rejected. So as you no doubt know by now, the Sunlight Access qualifying matter has been recommended to be rejected, and the IHP have instead recommended that MDRS standard as it is applied instead of that. We had also proposed an exemption to that within the high density zone and also within the local centre intensification precinct, which we'll put that aside because it's been rejected or recommended to be rejected at this point. But within the high density extent, effectively what it means is that if you are set back between 6 to 8 metres from the side boundary or any other boundary, excluding the road boundary, then there is no recession plan that would apply for buildings above 12 metres. It's intending to ensure that it makes it easy to develop at a high density extent. The IHP have recommended that it gets accepted. So when you see the provisions together, it is medium density MDRS standards as they are in the Act for less than 12, and then above 12, if you comply with that setback, like I said, then there is no recession plan that would apply. The low public transport accessibility qualifying matter, again, recommended to be rejected. Simply medium density would apply within those areas. Rickon and Bush interface area, I've mentioned, we're seeking clarification on some elements in there, as there seems to be suggestion that the operative zoning would hold. So, yeah, that seems unclear to us, and so we'll be seeking clarification on that matter. The airport noise influence area, somewhat, the approach is really recommended to be rejected. So effectively what the IHP have said is that medium density and high density that would otherwise exist beneath that as in terms of being a relevant residential zone or a catchment where high density would exist should proceed. And anywhere where there is a development of 3 or more units, that there should be additional standards for mechanical ventilation and things like that as well. So effectively what they said is that noise insulation requirements should apply, but that shouldn't restrain the application of medium and high density beneath the airport noise contour. They've also recommended, I believe, to apply a lesser extent than what was the most recent in there as well. But if there's interest in that, we can provide some further detail separately to this. Any new or expanded residential character areas has also been recommended to be rejected. And again, that's on the basis of the High Court decision for being more restrictive than operative. For that same reason, residential heritage areas and their interfaces have been recommended to be rejected as well. And any new heritage items. The city spine was a qualifying matter that we sought to introduce along the most prominent transport corridor, effectively Papanui into the city centre and then through to Riccarton Road. And that was to introduce a greater setback from the road, and that has also been recommended to be rejected as well. Any new, updated, significant noble or heritage trees would contravene the High Court direction, and so effectively what that means is that the operative schedule of significant trees and alike would hold, and so no new change there. Financial contributions for tree canopy cover as well. Victoria Street height limit and Cathedral Square height limit, like I mentioned, that was at 45 metres. There is effectively no limit that would be there. It would simply be considered through matters of discretion and the consenting pathway there, but there isn't effectively quite a stringent control that we would otherwise have through the notified proposals. And the same for radio communication pathways, as mentioned earlier, would contravene the High Court decision. There are a number of qualifying matters that the IHP have recommended to be accepted. Being new qualifying matters, I haven't listed the operative ones because if they haven't been listed in the previous slide, they've been recommended to be accepted. The coastal hazards qualifying matter is one of those, and that introduces controls that assists really in the overarching delivery of the future plan change for Plan Change 12. So that assists in the larger plan change program that Council has in that regard. The industrial interface qualifying matter we had proposed to apply, funnily enough, around all industrial areas where there is an interface with residential areas. And effectively what that says is that there's a restriction in terms of the height. So 8 metres there's no controls, that's fine. And beyond that, there's more controls in terms of mechanical ventilation, and then where you put your balcony space, it's not oriented directly towards industrial areas, that it's faced away from those areas. And so there's greater controls around that. Again, that assists in the future for any other prospective plan change that Council seeks to progress for industrial zoning and alike. Like I mentioned, the wastewater constraints qualifying matter, that very much assists in terms of 3 water planning, or mainly wastewater planning, of course, within those areas. And then the Littleton commercial building heights was a lesser commercial height within Littleton commercial area, and that was on the basis that it supports heritage, noted heritage areas that we had there, and also the character areas of Littleton as well. So that's really the summary of the list of qualifying matters, new ones that have been sought to be retained. So again, this has been a overview of the key matters, but certainly isn't everything that has been recommended, but we're quite open to hearing your feedback on, like Brent said, points of clarity, but also if you want any other topics to be explored in more detail for the session for next week as well.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for going through that so well. It's a very good presentation. So we've got questions from Tyler, then Yanni, and Tyrone.
Apologies, Pauline, I've got a few, if that's
A
right.
few. Well, we've only got like 15 minutes, so
I'll whiz through them, promise.
rattle through.
Okay, the first one is around potential proactive recommendations in light of PC13 and the noise catchments. For example, if we're looking at Riccarton as such, there are a couple, for example, heritage sites. Do we review those in PC13 or do we have to review those here in the PC14 deliberations? I'm pinning down Pico Crescent, to be clear.
From what I can recall from the sender file, I'm just going to go back to the image. Sorry for the flashing for those watching online. Just 2 seconds. Okay. So applying this catchment in terms of how we've interpreted what the IHP have recommended, from my understanding, wouldn't influence Pico Shand area because it lies outside of that.
Just outside of the MRZ.
Yeah, that's right. So if council intends to only make a policy 3-4 decision, then there isn't any influence really as such on Pico Shand's area, considering whether it's now, again, like I said, the mapping validation process is something that we have yet to initiate with the IHP. This is our interpretation of what they have, the narrative that they've set.
Yep.
We're relatively confident on this boundary, but nonetheless they may have a different opinion.
Okay, and I'll take the other ones offline. I've just got one more question, and it's around the noise catchment provisions, particularly around development and installing further insulation, particularly around the 55 decibel area. I'm wondering if there's potential for extension across that island catchment
How do you
proactively.
mean?
So it's addressing multiple issues. One is obviously the students are going to be extremely prevalent in terms of populating the island catchment.
Sure.
So throughout those, the noise provisions that the airport has recommended, which was rejected partially, I'm wondering if council by right might be able to extend further restrictions or provisions to add more insulation across those medium residential zone areas and high residential zone areas.
Like mentioned earlier, it would only be relevant to evidence that has been presented for an extension of that catchment.
Okay.
And so if there's an interest then to explore that, then we can provide a summary or, like Brent said, a bundle of the evidence that's relevant to that, and it's up for you to consider whether or not that's a possibility.
Okay, I'll take everything else offline. Thanks.
Kia ora. Yanni?
And I was just going to say, I don't think we've really got enough time to go into details. So, I mean, just at a high level, I guess I've got, like Tyler, I'll just ask one question and then maybe send them through. But I do think we need more time as councillors on this, given the significance of it.
It's another session.
Yeah, okay.
Is it-
Second session.
Yeah, cool. Just when I look at the kind of maps and it is quite hard to see what's current, what we notified and what's proposed. And I don't know if we're able to do that. I guess I'm just trying to understand the sense of change that's been enabled. One specific question I had was just reflecting on some of the areas under the current plan with the way in which the communities are becoming dangerous because there's not sufficient space for traffic, either cars that are being generated by these new developments, provision for cycleways or pedestrian pathways. So what kind of assessment's done? I look at the Maryvale map that you showed. I don't know if you can put it up there, but when I look at the enabling of the intensification in, say, like Maryvale, where we've got currently at the moment streets that can barely function with existing traffic, what assessment or consideration, if any, is done around the cumulative impact of all that intensification on our transport system?
The only way we can answer that question, Councillor, is by referring you to the content of the IHP report and the evidence and the submissions on that point.
So did they look at transport effects?
The only thing we can do to answer that question is by referring you to those sections.
Right. Okay, but in terms of the information, you'll be able to provide us with the IHP's assessment of the traffic impact. I'm just trying to understand from a technical or legal, I guess, process question, around whether that's a relevant consideration? Is it something that they just, like the government says you have to intensify, therefore no regard to things like car parking or transport, or is there an ability for us to consider what those impacts are in terms of the environment?
The only thing you can consider is the same things that the IHP considered. They're the only things you can consider. So you can consider the evidence and the submissions that they heard. Now, in order to answer that question, what we would do is that the IHP, by the way, have stated repeatedly in their decision that they have taken into account all relevant considerations. And I've got no doubt that that is their legal obligation and they've performed it. So what we will do is, to answer that question, we'll refer you, we'll
To the relevant section.
put a bundle together for you on it.
Thank you. Tyrone?
If the Littleton Port Noise overlay was removed, what sort of unintended knock-on impact might that have for the sort of the qualifying matters for Littleton's commercial centre as it stands?
Sorry, if I can clarify the question, are you asking whether or not the removal of the interface would have an influence on the commercial zoning?
Commercial operations, is what you're asking.
So,
Do you want to take that offline and put it through?
take it offline.
Yeah, I
Put it
think
through
take it
the-
offline and we can.
Put it through the office.
Yeah,
put
that's
the
all right,
question
okay.
through. Thank you. So at the end of the questions then. It's been a bit of an information tsunami. Sarah?
Sorry, something that came up during your presentation that I hadn't caught in the documents was the use of the centre for not just the central city zone, but for the local centres as well. So can we get more information? My understanding is the NPSUD was quite prescriptive on the panel using, on decisions being made based on a perimeter.
If I can clarify that, that's only that specific direction on the edge of the zone is only specified for the city centre.
Oh, okay.
So the policy 3D, which is for all of the other centres outside of that, only says that there should be a commensurate response of intensification and building form from those centres.
But it was very specific about the central city zone having a walkable catchment.
Yes,
From
that's
the
right.
perimeter of the central city
Correct.
zone.
So policy 3C something from the central city says that there should be at least a walking catchment of 6 stories, of at least 6 stories from the edge of the central city zone. That's correct.
So they could have chosen to do a different size central city zone and then done walkable catchment outside there, or is the zone already...
The zone is as it is. So effectively what the NPSUD asks council to contemplate is what is the equivalent zoning under national planning standards for central city zone, and so that exists as it is. There's no scope to be able to change the commercial boundaries, if you will. It's more taken from the boundary of where the catchment is as of today. Yep.
Thank you. Oh, Mark and then Yanni.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on quite a specific point, Ravensdown, and a proposal there for a buffer zone. Do you have any...
Just to be clear, in terms of what we, through the council, well, the Ravensdown element of the qualified matter was a submission that we were responding to. What the IHP have recommended is that the specific area being 240 metres from the edge of the commercial zoning of Ravensdown should be limited to medium density only, not high density. And all glazing above 8 metres within that 240 metre buffer should be stain resistant, and any buildings higher than 14 metres should be a non-complying activity. So when we're talking about activity status, that's the top of the top.
Right.
Yeah. So they have accepted that as a qualified matter. They have rejected any high density that would otherwise be there because of the proximity to the commercial centre of Hornby, and medium density is the maximum, and it's a pretty hard ceiling under this, what they've recommended. Yeah.
Thank you.
And is that falling within the policy 3.4 or is that
Correct.
outside?
Yes.
So Yanni?
Yeah, I was just trying to understand, like, around things like noise. Have they made changes?
Can you be more specific?
Oh, like, so I'm looking at their website and it says district plan text amendments, and then there's a whole section on like noise. But you know, they've removed a lot of the qualifying matters from it. But in terms of things like noise, I'm just trying to understand whether the IHP's decision is more enabling or more restrictive. I couldn't understand from reading that chapter, like, yeah, I mean, they've done a lot around the airport. Like, there's stuff around the port.
Sure. I can't say I'm immediately familiar around the noise aspects, but we're happy to come back to you on in detail that if you like.
Right. And can we get some information around whether vibrations were considered as well? Because that
Yes.
seems to be something that's, yeah, I can't see reference to it. But,
Do you mean vibration more generally for all residential development or for specific areas?
well, it's just that, like, in the noise chapter, there's, I mean, I can't. Yeah, it's very technical, obviously, but yeah, was there any consideration of vibration effects from things like the port, for example?
Okay, for specific areas. Okay.
And specific areas. I mean, I'd like to know more about that whole industrial interface and what's been accepted, and just kind of understand, yeah, the implications. I see
Yes.
in some of the rules, like, for example, my understanding is the port pays for insulation in residential up to 60 grand. Yeah, so
Yep. If the residential, the industrial interface provisions are contained in the medium density chapter MRZ 14.5, if you're interested in those specific provisions.
yeah, cool. And the other thing I was really interested to understand, which I've raised previously, but was really getting an understanding of the evidence and the decision making around the social impact assessment, and also the engagement with Māori. My understanding from reading initially was that there was some concern from the IHP around the sufficiency of that evidence, and I'd like to kind of get an understanding of what that information was, and
Sure.
then maybe we flag in terms of, I don't know if there's a possibility that we actually commission more work or what we do in that space.
Okay.
Through you, Chair, no, the council can't commission more work before making a decision on the IHP recommendations. The only thing the council can consider is the same things that the IHP considered.
And if they didn't consider those, they're out of line. So just get some information, would be good. Yep. Mark?
Yep. Before the September decision meeting, are we likely to get definitive, sort of finalish planning maps to help?
Yeah, that's correct. So in order for you to make your decision, you need to have all the relevant information. We are currently, right now, doing the mapping directions that the IHP have put forward. They haven't issued maps. They've issued a table of directions and many other tables of specific zone changes as well that we're working through. And we intend to provide that to you once it's been completed.
Look forward to that.
Great, appreciate it.
And Tyler and then Sarah, just very quickly, we've got 2 minutes left.
Sure. Kia ora, guys. You did ask if we were interested in different matters to let you know. I'd like to give you a list, but it's pretty much everything that relates to Riccarton, which includes the sunlight access QM, the low public transport accessibility QM, the Riccarton bush interface, the airport noise contours. All of those would be great if they're the ones that are relevant to Riccarton, but they will be also citywide.
Just to be clear, the low public transport accessibility qualified matter, I don't believe has any influence in Riccarton.
The reason being is the walkable catchment is 800 metres around the Dean's precinct, and the city spine QM, which I can't talk about. I do want to talk about the walkable catchments as they are.
Okay,
because
so
there are
your
some-
interest is more the walkable catchments rather than
Yeah,
the low
sorry.
public transport
Yes,
qualified
apologies.
matter.
Yep, apologies.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Thanks.
Tara?
No, I'll email it.
Yeah, so any other questions that come to mind, whether it's the middle of the night or tomorrow, just fire them through the office of the CE, and then staff will provide advice and collate it all together and get it back to us. So the next session, is that next week? Or
Yes,
next
next Tuesday.
next Tuesday? Another session next Tuesday. Is that also an hour and a half? Decent period, I think. Yeah.
It is hour and a half. at the moment. Needs longer, you think?
I reckon.
Okay,
We'll see if we
look
can
at that.
stretch it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll look at that.
Thank you. If you can have a look at that. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for your patience, because you probably know this stuff inside out, but you're explaining it really well. So thanks, Brent and I.
I did think about, we have to, the one thing is we have to do a plan change under the current RMA, we're supposed to do a full district plan review every 10 years. This is not for the decision making, but just like, what impact does doing all of these other plan changes in the meantime mean for the necessity to start a review 10 years from the last full district plan thing, which was 2015?
Just to be clear, the Act requires that every 10 years it gets monitored. It doesn't mean that a plan change is required. And so a monitoring exercise report may conclude that no plan change is required because multiple other plan changes have effectively achieved an updated relevance of the district plan overall.
Okay, but we just have to make a decision on not to do it next year sometime.
Potentially.
Okay, just checking. just don't want to have to do all this again.
We'll come back with further advice on that. Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So back here at 1:30 for the last two briefings of the day.